Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Bible study for the 19th of May, 2021. This is Pastor James Merriam for the United Church of Newport. We're going to be reading from the writings of the prophet Ezekiel today, and I'm in a little bit of a different location because actually my wife has had a pretty bad response to the had some side effects for the second dose of the COVID vaccine, and so has gone to bed. So I am out in the living room and watching our daughter, who you might be able to hear in the background. She's very enthusiastic about the prophet Ezekiel. Now, of course, upcoming this Sunday is the Sunday of Pentecost. So both we have our regular 9 a.m. virtual worship right here on NEKTV and on YouTube. And we have my ordination ceremony, which is at 3 o'clock in the church's land which is called Magoon Park on City Farm Road in Newport Town. All are welcome to join for that service. It will be a masked event, but an outdoor with singing event. And I am looking forward to it very, very, very much. So that's going to be a wonderful event coming up this Sunday. We're hoping for good weather. So, also gratitude to those who helped us organize last Saturday's USDA food box giveaway at the United Church. We'll be doing that again in a couple of weeks. We'll also be hosting a small yard sale as part of the citywide yard sale. Those are coming up on the 29th of May. So we are going to be reading from Ezekiel, and this is an accessory reading that's added as well into the readings for the day of Pentecost. Yes, I know. My daughter is on the other side of the room, very excited about Ezekiel on the day of Pentecost. And it is the most famous reading from Ezekiel, probably by a pretty wide margin. Maybe the one contender for another thing that Ezekiel's best known for is the wheel in the sky sort of metaphor or depiction of a UFO, or scriptural depiction of a UFO. But this is Ezekiel in the valley of the dry bones. And so this is something that's probably you heard in Sunday school, or maybe you've been familiar with in some way. It's almost synonymous with Ezekiel in sort of the popular imagination and popular reference. But it's, we're going to get into it. This is just the 14 verses, chapter 37, verses 1 through 14, with a lot of repetition, but a lot of ambiguity that can be really, really cool and really exciting. And it's used in reference as sort of a counterpoint to the prophesying of of Peter and the other disciples and the other followers of Jesus in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. Maybe mostly for two reasons. First, because it is the word of the Lord and just the spirit of prophecy coming in an unexpected place. And also because of sort of the mix of description and metaphor in translation in different languages, of course, because the New and the Old Testament were written in different languages than each other and different languages than we're reading them in. The tongues of flame that touched the disciples on the day of Pentecost, and the wind or breath of God that is in the dry bones with Ezekiel. There's certainly a similarity. There's no question there's a similarity. There's no question there's a relatedness between these two things. But are they the same? It's kind of, you be the judge. So, at the beginning of chapter 37, this is the writings of the prophet Ezekiel, verses 1 through 14. The hand of the Lord was upon me, and he took me out by the wind of the Lord and set me down in the valley, and it was filled with bones. And he made me pass by them all around, and look, there were very many on the surface of the valley, and look, they were very dry. And he said to me, Man, can these bones live? And I said, O Master, Lord, it is you who knows. And he said, Prophesy to these bones, and say to them, O dry bones, listen to the word of the Lord. Thus said the Master, the Lord, to the dry bones, I am about to bring breath into you, and you shall live. and I will lay sinews over you and bring up flesh over you and stretch over you skin. And I will put breath in you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am the Lord. And I prophesied as I was charged, and there was a sound as I prophesied, and look, a clatter, and the bones came together, one bone to another. And I saw, and look, upon them were sinews, and flesh came up, and skin stretched out over them from above, but there was no breath in them. And he said to me, prophesy to the wind. Prophesy, man, and say to the wind, thus says the Master, the Lord, from the four winds, come, wind, and blow into these slain, that they may live. And I prophesied as he had charged me, and the breath came into them, and they lived, and they stood up on their feet, a very great legion. And he said to me, man, these bones are all the house of Israel. They say, our bones are dry, and our hope is lost. We have been cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, thus said the Master, the Lord, I am about to open your graves, and I will bring you up, my people, from your graves, and bring you to Israel's soil. And you shall know that I am the Lord, when I open your graves, and when I bring you up from your graves, my people. And I will put my breath in you, and you shall live, and I will set you on your soil, and you shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken and have done it, said the Lord. That's the end of chapter 14 verses. This chapter does continue, and I will often continue and read more than the lectionary suggests, but in this instance it's really going on and making a different point and a different story. And one could sort of question why it's not actually a chapter break. It kind of would make more sense, frankly, for me reading it, that it'd be a chapter break. The chapters don't necessarily make that much sense. They're really just guiding tools. So complete thought, 14 verses, complete story, complete description, amazing description we're probably pretty familiar with. I should note that I'm reading from my enormous study Old Testament. This is the Prophets section of Robert Alter's new translation of the Hebrew Bible. That's from just a couple of years ago, very, very recent, and the project of decades to do an exhaustive translation from Hebrew into English to get as close to the sort of literal and in context meaning while maintaining something of the poetic rhythm as much as possible. Now, of course, we've read a lot from these translations, especially in the Prophets, which is really poetry and is really explicitly poetry. This section, as you can see, is not broken out like poetry. It's broken out in paragraphs. It's not in lines. It's not meant to rhyme, but it's a powerful, powerful prose story. My daughter is kicking over on the other side of the room, very excited. I know, this is just great stuff. But what we have repeated time and again is this concept of breath. And there are several different words used in this translation, and then there are several different, even beyond those words, that are used in other translations to try to get a meaning to the Hebrew word ruach, which is sometimes translated as breath, sometimes wind, and sometimes spirit. And so you'll have translations that are trying to put this this passage into sort of the same box as the passage of the days of Pentecost, and call it all spirit, that it's all spirit altogether, to translate ruah as spirit in all cases. Now, of course, the ruah is also what went over the water in Genesis 1. It was the breath of God. It was the wind of God. It's the wind of the Spirit. It's the Spirit of God itself. The wind over the water is then emulated again when Jesus is baptized, when the Spirit goes over the water like a dove, as if it flies, as if it's moving, as if it's going. So you have really even dove, spirit, breath, wind, even just like inhalation, all generally representing the same thing, but representing subtly different things. And Alter makes really kind of the focus of interpretation of this passage really being that they're not really the same thing, but it's using the same word to talk about different things. which in some contexts is considered sloppy if you were doing a very precise logical argument. But this is a prophecy. It's a poetic story. It's a story of inspiration and literal rebirth. So even just the very first verse, the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he took me out by the wind of the Lord and set me down in the valley. So this is maybe a vision, but the experience is of bodily transfer, bodily, just like being swept away by what has to be called a wind. It's not the Spirit of the Lord, it's a physical wind. It's not that he was whipped up into such a zeal that he transported, it's that he was carried by the wind. He's carried into a dry place. So of course in the ancient Near East you have these powerful, sometimes sandstorms, these powerful hot transforming winds that really are maybe one of the are as big an effect on the land and as big an effect on the culture as snowstorms are in Vermont. Your house has to be tight against snowstorms, and it's in these times that you recognize it's to these intense hot sandstorm winds are what everything is built towards and what you save the year around to be ready for. To a great extent, in some parts of the world they're called the haboob winds, the haboob sandstorms, and it's kind of it's a cultural phenomenon, really, and it's one of the great ways in which God is avenging is through the power of these hot winds. This is not the avenging God. This is not a punishing wind, though it does take Ezekiel without his consent off into what is explicitly a terrible place, a place that is so parched and dry and just full of bones. Then as now, it's very clear, and it says Ezekiel notes that the bones are very dry, that he could see everything in this valley very well. You can see that these bones are very dry, that it's been a long time since these bones were parts of living things, and it's been explicitly that in a dry place, bones can last a long time. It's one of the ways things get fossilized, is being dried out really dramatically and then getting buried as if by a sudden rain event. That's really why we have a lot of dinosaur bones, actually, is that they died in very dry places and then were suddenly buried. So these bones could have been there for decades. These bones could have been there for centuries, which is exactly the kind of time frame that Ezekiel works in, exactly because Ezekiel was a prophet after the exile, and that though the people were freed from their exile in Babylon, they were still scattered, and things were not going back together the way they should be. Return to Jerusalem was not suddenly just everything being okay, because during the exile and before and after, things kept falling apart. The people kept getting scattered. The people kept feeling desperate, feeling hopeless, feeling helpless. And then, of course, in the new reality, though the Persians who freed the Israelites from captivity in Babylon allowed them to return to their ways of worship, they're not free. They're not independent. They're not their own. And there's a lot of debate in the community about what it means to be the people of God in this sort of new reality. So centuries passed, centuries since God was worshipped in the old way, in the way of Scripture. Debate about how to even get back to that, debate about whether we should get back to that, whether there's a new thing to get to, there's a new thing to angle towards. And the dry bones get scattered further and further and further. And there are those who would despair that this nation can ever be put back together and can ever live in the way that it once did. And so Ezekiel sees these bones and sees that, obviously, just from the common sense of being a person who had lived in the world in a dry place, who had seen old bones in dry places his whole life, responds to God asking him this rhetorical question, "Man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel says, "O Master, Lord, it is you who knows." recognizing that never in his life, never could he have imagined that bones like this could still be alive or could be returned to life. But he knows the power of the Lord. He knows the power of the Lord to know these things, and he knows the power of the Lord to do these things. And so the Lord says to Ezekiel, prophesy to these bones and say to them, O dry bones, listen to the word of the Lord. Thus said the Master, the Lord, to the dry bones, I am about to bring breath into you, and you shall live, and I will lay sinew over you and bring up flesh. So again, we have the use of the ruah. So first the ruah was the wind that took Ezekiel out into this valley, and now the ruah is the breath that will animate the bones, that will animate the new, or that will represent that these bones are alive once again. And I will lay sinews over you and bring up flesh over you and stretch over you skin. And I will put breath into you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am the Lord. So again, breath in the very bones, and then all the flesh and all the rest of what these bones were once, the people they once were, all come back, all here, all reanimated and full of life and full of breath, which is the symbol of life in this ancient society. And I prophesied as I was charged, and there was a sound. And I prophesied, and look, a clatter, and the bones came together, one bone to another. And I saw, and look upon them, sinews and flesh came up, and skin stretched over them from above, but there was no breath in them. So now we have something that's more like the wind has come and brought the bones together. First, so the clattering of the bones coming together is what we often sort of focus on and remember and think about, and it's sort of like the xylophone sound that's sometimes used in like music about Halloween, about skeletons, Night on Bald Mountain, or something like that. The bones came together and were made back into bodies and sinews and flesh and muscles, and all the things that make us living things came upon them, and it was like they were bodies, but they did not have life. So it's as if the wind has blown them together, but they do not have the breath. They do not have the life. So it's like the ruah, the power of the Lord, has brought them together, but they do not have that breath of their own. And he said to me, prophesy to the winds, prophesy, man, and say to the winds, thus says the Master, the Lord, from the four winds come wind, and blow into these slain that they may live. So now we have a weird contrast of it's like the Lord, the breath of the Lord brings the bones together, but then the Lord asks the winds, which is the four cardinal directions, which is an ancient understanding of just like the way the world is. The four winds are representative, are metaphors. The four winds are included in Genesis chapter 1, and now it's that the power that God has put into the world will come into these bodies and make them back alive. We also have a specification that we hadn't heard anywhere else before, that these bodies were slain, that these were the remnants of a massacre, that these were those not who had been scattered by natural forces or anything else, but that these were bones of a people who were scattered by conquerors who wanted to erase them from all history. And I prophesied as he has charged me, and the breath came into them, and they lived, and they stood up on their feet, a very, very great legion. Often modern translations will get rid of will change the word legion just to crowd or multitude or something like that, because legion seems too military, and in very recent years has been associated with demons overly strongly. The King James Version just calls it army, but they really all kind of mean the same thing. And it's not a mob, it's not a crowd, it's an orderly group, but a group of huge numbers. So the bones were uncountable, they come together and they become uncountably many people. And he said to me, man, these bones are all the house of Israel. So uncountably many but orderly and ready to do what the Lord has asked them to. They say, our bones are dry and our hope is lost. We have been cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, thus said the Master, the Lord, I am about to open your graves, and I will bring you up, my people, from your graves and bring you to Israel's soil. So actually, Alter makes slightly a bit of a joke here by saying that Ezekiel appears to have forgotten that the bones are scattered on the surface of the valley. Now the dead have been buried and will rise from their graves. I would say maybe there's something of a deeper metaphor here, that that during this time of exile, the culture was able to be maintained in Babylon and back in Jerusalem to a certain extent. And now a lot of people are gathered back in Jerusalem and are still doing the things in their cultural ways and in their orderly ways, and many people are still together. So this is a representation of that God can bring up and reanimate and reinvigorate and lift up the house of Israel, even from this desperate, dry place of massacre and desolation centuries gone. You guys can get up from your graves. It is an easy thing by comparison. You who are lying yourself down in your own graves of despair, get up now. For the Lord can bring you back from the absolute desolation of the dry bones, the desolation of the scattered bones. The Lord can bring you back from the tiniest remnant centuries and centuries later. You are far from that, so get up. Get up, and with the assistance of the Lord, remake the house of Israel as it was and better. My people, and I will put my breath in you, and you shall live, and I will set you on your soil, and you shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken and have done it. So this is maybe the closest comparison, and of course is the last verse of our reading. So the verse that rings in everyone's ears, that is easiest to remember, that is most stuck, and is the focal point of this reading. I will put my breath in you, and you shall live. Again, the Ruah. Again, the Spirit of the Lord. And this is maybe more like spirit. Other times it's really been explicitly wind or breath or flow. But this is really more like spirit. The Spirit to speak. The Spirit not only to have that breath, but to use that breath. And that's more like what happens on the day of Pentecost. Now, of course, on the day of Pentecost, the maybe 150 members of the Jesus movement who are gathered in Jerusalem are far from being scattered in a desert place. They're full of uncertainty. They're fearful of what's going to happen next. But they are not being rebuilt from nothing. Nevertheless, the Spirit of the Lord animates them and inspires them in ways that no one could have imagined, because, of course, they speak in the market square. They speak with incredible voices of just inspiration. They speak with words and languages, but words beyond themselves, or words they did not imagine were beyond themselves. Or they imagined were beyond themselves. They did not imagine that could be their own. And so the comparison between these two is somewhat similar. Now, of course, it may actually fit better with, it's widely thought that the same author wrote the Gospel according to Luke and wrote the Acts of the Apostles, and that it's likely that the Acts of the Apostles were written quite a bit later. They are really one narrative, but sort of with a voice that some people read as just being sort of older and more cynical, maybe, older and wiser, older and more hopeful in Acts versus Luke. And so we have at the beginning of Acts perhaps an author who was once optimistic, but since he wrote once very optimistic about sort of the unified spirit of God, or the unified presence of God in people, and people really working together through the Spirit of God. Since then, he had seen the conquest of Jerusalem by the Romans after the first Jewish revolts. He had seen the temple burning, or heard about it. He had seen the people once again scattered in particular ways. He knew that this would happen again, and even more so because it was not too far in the future, about 100 years after Jesus died, when the temple was just completely destroyed. And the city of Jerusalem was almost completely destroyed and remade and shifted around, and all Jews were banned from even being within sight of the city of Jerusalem, and which is an order that stood for centuries. And Jerusalem was renamed and lost its association, and its old name was forgotten almost completely, in a issue that comes down to this very day, because when the Muslims when Muhammad arrived in Jerusalem, about 5 centuries later, he would have asked, "What is the city called?" And the Romans there would have said the Roman name, the name that had been given to it after it was destroyed. And he never would have heard the name Jerusalem, never once. No one called it that. No one could ever remember anyone who had ever called it that. It was technically illegal to call it that. And so to this very day, the Palestinians refer to Jerusalem as Isla, and the Jews call it Jerusalem. And even that linguistic tool of conquest from centuries ago causes strife and conflict, because they call the same city, different things. Changes in names rooted in violence and hatred and destruction, but not their own violence and hatred and destruction. So why can't we even agree on the name? Because we both have centuries and centuries and centuries of basis to call it the name that it is our tradition to call this city. If there ever was dry bones and desolation, impossible to rebuild, nothing but death, God has brought us back from far worse situations, and we would do well to remember it. That's the message to Ezekiel. That's the message from Ezekiel. And that is the message for us in our darkest, deepest, most terrible despair. For ourselves, perhaps, but certainly for the world. And as we come back from this time of pandemic, let us remember that the Ruach, the breath of God, is in us to help us prophesy, to help us tell the truth, to help us be the voice of God, to do God's work in all the world. And thanks be to God for that and that opportunity. Now, everyone, get your vaccines. Trust in the balm of Gilead, by which we will be restored, that we will be made once again whole, to make this nation whole. Stay safe, do good work, keep in touch, and we'll see you again soon. God bless.